Famous pianists and their technique. Hummel, the culmination of the Viennese era. Summary by Laura Aguirre. Chapter 5 begins with a little bit of history on Johann Nepomuk Hummel. He was an Austrian pianist and composer, and back in that time he was considered kind of like Beethoven's equal. In 1786, his father got the idea to have Hummel audition for Mozart so that he could be one of Mozart's pupils. So they traveled to Vienna and they requested an audition. Mozart at the time really didn't want to be teaching. You know, he wasn't fond of teaching. He wanted to compose and he thought it took away too much time from his composition work. But he still heard Hummel's performance and he ended up playing some Bach for Mozart. And Mozart was pretty impressed. Mozart also gave him one of his own pieces to sight read, and the history there is that Mozart really liked his abilities and took him on as a student. The audition was a success, and Hummel ended up living with the Mozarts for about 2 years. Mozart was in need of money, so he had a lot of financial problems. As we know, a lot of Mozart's history is he wasn't very good with his money, and he needed to take on pupils. And there's like a letter that he wrote to his father talking about how, you know, he's not too happy having students, but he needs the students, and he's not thrilled when they cancel or they're not home for their lessons. And I guess, you know, kind of what modern day piano teachers have to deal with, which is also mentioned in the book, that we have to deal with inconsistencies with students and such. But Hummel, being around the Mozarts, learned a lot, and being in the home was exposed to a lot of music there, and they became quite confident for him to do some sort of concert touring. So Hummel's dad took him to Germany, England, and Scotland. They did some tours there. Hummel also studied with Clementi, and he did some theory and composition study with Alberstenberger, I hope I said that correctly, Salieri, and Haydn. There's a story here from 1804 about Hummel and Beethoven. At the time, Hummel became the Kapellmeister for the Prince Esterhazy in Eisenstadt. I hope I did say that right too. And this was in 1884, as I said. Beethoven was in town at the time to hear a performance on his Mass in C major. So Schindler says that he had this, I guess he witnessed this account here, what happened, that there was a misunderstanding apparently between Hummel and Beethoven. It was after the performance, and the prince was asking Beethoven about the Mass, and Beethoven saw Hummel laugh. And it was, I think, the prince was in a sense criticizing the Mass or something along those lines, and Hummel was actually laughing at the way the prince was criticizing Beethoven's music, is what I'm assuming here. But Beethoven, of course, took it personally and thought Hummel was laughing directly at him. It turns out probably been some crazy misunderstanding, but there was always some sort of weirdness between Beethoven and Hummel. Apparently Beethoven also wasn't too fond of Hummel's playing ability, and at one point I think they were chasing the same girl, is what is stated here. So, the drama. So there was a little bit of tension between Hummel and Beethoven. We have an encounter between Hummel and Czerny. Karl Czerny, as we know, is an Austrian pianist, composer, and teacher, and between 1801 and 1804, Czerny writes in his Recollections from My Life that him and his father used to visit Mozart's widow every Saturday. There'd be some sort of musical performance. In particular, Mozart's youngest son would be one of the performers. And at one of these events, Czerny also discovered Hummel. At first, he kind of judged him on his appearance, saying that Hummel had an unpleasant, uncommon-looking face, which twitched constantly, and that he had bad taste in clothing. But of course, as soon as he started playing his music, Czerny quickly realized how talented Hummel was, and that he had a wonderful elegance with his performance and tenderness and expression. As we know, Czerny is one of Beethoven's pupils and was a devoted student of Beethoven, but he quickly became a fan of Hummel's. So he probably maybe was kind of torn, I think, between the two in terms of which one is the better musician, pianist. Czerny says that Beethoven, his playing was remarkable with enormous power and characteristic expression, and that he had unheard of virtuosity in passage work. This is all page 68 and 69. But he also says that Hummel's performances, that they were a model of cleanness, clarity, and that they were most graceful and elegance with tenderness, All difficulties were calculated for the greatest and most stunning effects. I think a lot of people at this time as well is what Czerny says, that there was a bunch of people that were fans of Hummel, a bunch of people that were fans of Beethoven. I'm calling them Team Hummel, Team Beethoven. So the Hummel fans, they were the ones actually accusing Beethoven of mistreating the piano and of lacking all cleanness and clarity, of creating nothing but confused noise the way he used the pedal, and finally of writing willful, unnatural, unmelodic compositions, and that they felt they were kind of irregular. Where all the Beethoven fans say that Hummel lacked all genuine imagination and that his playing was as monotonous and as hurdy-gurdy, as monotonous as a hurdy-gurdy, that the position of his fingers reminded them of spiders, and that his compositions were nothing more than arrangements of motives by Mozart and Haydn. So kind of interesting here that there were two popular guys and people were kind of choosing sides. One of the most important works on technique and piano playing of the 19th century was published by Hummel in 1828. It contained 3 volumes of information for piano teachers and for parents of piano students. There was 2,200 technical exercises and musical examples included. In the preface, it states that a student should practice 1 hour a day if they are beginners, for about 6 months to a year, and then once they become more advanced students, it should be 3 hours a day. Female students should start around age 7, boys should start around age 8, and then there was some chief qualities listed that a good master should possess, and these are qualities that even today a piano teacher should kind of demonstrate as well. That is, interest in students' progress, that should remain always. No bad habits should be allowed. The teacher should include other pleasing pieces so that the student remains amused and encouraged. So don't scare off any beginners with something too difficult. Also, the teacher should have the student practice reading notes without looking at their hands. That way they don't rely on memorization. This is still a very big deal today. Don't allow for fast playing, as that encourages sloppy playing. Be skillful with marking time. The teacher should help the student feel and keep tempo. Make that a good habit. And then lastly, keep the instrument in tune as to help the student develop a good ear. So part 1 of Hummel's work is basic elementary instruction, and it deals with the fundamentals. Here he wrote 617 one-measure 5-finger patterns that the pupil should practice, and once you get towards the end of part 1, there are 60 practical pieces that the student will play as well that illustrates what you should have learned in the first section of the book. It even has instruction on physical approach to the instrument. Chapter 1 includes sitting at the piano and the distance and height of your bench. Chapter 2 talks about the body, arms, hands, and fingers, how the body should be held upright. Your muscles in your arms should not be stiff. Your hands should be rounded and relaxed. The proper thumb placement and the touch of the instrument, how to strike the key correctly. And then, of course, some bad habits to avoid, such as biting the lips or nodding your head to mark tempo or playing with your mouth open. Stating here that the pianist should be sitting with a graceful demeanor while at the instrument. In the concluding portion of part 1, Hummel provides a supplementary chapter that suggests graded pieces for the aspiring student. So I've supplied some screenshots here of what the selections look like. Instead of reading through every single one, you can get an idea of how he had this kind of mapped out, probably starting from an intermediate level, advancing to more difficult music. As far as part 2 and part 3 of Hummel's book, part 2 basically focuses on fingering technique. There's even 200 pieces in that portion that just strictly deal with the thumb, the use of the thumb and avoiding black keys and proper fingering for that. Part 3 deals with the musicality and interpretation of music. He discusses ornamentation, pedaling, and the mere beauty, the mere musicality of the piece, and how to be more expressive. So to elaborate on Hummel's final volume of his book, he goes into musical performance and details about that. One of the things he talks about is correctness versus beauty. Obviously, correctness is the mechanism of playing your notes and your technique must be correct, versus beauty, which would be the tastefulness and the ornamental style of playing. He talks about expression, that the performer must have some feeling with their music that the audience can also feel. It shouldn't just be for the musician, it should be also for the audience to experience. In terms of beauty of performance, that's something that can't be taught. And the student must experience other performers, other musicians playing expressively. That way they kind of see it instead of being explained what it is. I think it's easier to just see it and experience it from somebody else. Respecting the beauty of performance was another topic that he discusses here. He talks about finger mastery, that the musician must obey every finger movement in their performing. If they're too concerned with correct notes and correct technique, they're not going to be able to play expressively. Also, the musician should honor what the composer wants in terms of studying the character of the piece. If the composer wants the pianist to play adagio, then you must honor what the composer has written in the music. Lastly, he discussed proper piano touch on a German piano or an English piano. So I wrote on the side here some characteristics of each, that the German piano responds to light and powerful fingers, has a round flute-like sound, and has a very clear tone. So this piano is probably really good for quick passages and clean, I don't know, 16th note passages, probably something like that. And every note could be clearly heard. Versus an English piano was more durable, full tone, heavier touch, which made the keys sink lower so the hammers were not as fast. Once again, in comparison to the German piano, probably not a responsive instrument in terms of speed to play quickly. And lastly, it responded to a powerful arm weight versus powerful fingers. So you had to use a lot more arm, probably more upper body to play on the English piano to get the sound you wanted. In conclusion, after all of the work that Hummel put in his 3-volume work, A Complete Theoretical and Practical Course of Instruction on the Art of Playing the Pianoforte, Hummel did in fact influence some future composers such as Chopin and Schumann. His instruction material and detail to technique was more intricate than that of Clementi or Kramer at the time, but his contribution to piano technique did not reveal the true science behind it. So in the next chapters, we will discover what that true science is, but we can at least give Hummel credit for opening the doors to this technical piano world.